In 2006, a man appeared in Ukraine, claiming to be from 1958, with evidence so compelling that even the police couldn't explain it. He's not alone. Today I'm revealing 7 of the most mind-bending, bizarre, and shockingly convincing time traveler stories ever documented. According to Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, time and space are intrinsically linked, and the faster you travel, the slower you experience time. Let's dive into the first story, and trust me, this one is absolutely wild. April 2006, in the Ukrainian city of Kyiv. Police officers are patrolling the streets when they encounter a man dressed in clothing that looks like it's straight out of a 1950s movie. He's carrying a vintage camera and wandering around looking utterly confused and disoriented. The officers approach him, thinking he might be lost or perhaps mentally unwell. Then he asks a question that makes their blood run cold. What year is it? They tell him it's 2006. The police, now seriously concerned, take him into custody for questioning. Sitting in the interrogation room, the mysterious stranger identifies himself as Sergei Ponomarenko. And then he drops the bombshell. He claims he's from the year 1958. The officers naturally assume he's either joking or suffering from some kind of mental breakdown. But then Sergei hands them his identification card. The ID had been issued by the Soviet Union, which Ukraine hadn't been a part of since 1991, 15 years earlier. But how could that be possible? Sergei explains his story. He'd been on a walk with his fiancée, Valentina Kulish, when he noticed a strange, bell-shaped object hovering in the sky. Curious, he raised his camera and snapped a photograph. There was a blinding flash of light, and in an instant, everything changed. The buildings looked different, the cars were strange, and people were dressed in clothes he'd never seen before. He'd been transported forward in time to the exact same spot, but 48 years into the future. The police didn't know what to make of this. They decided to examine the camera he was carrying. Experts confirmed it was genuinely vintage, a model that had gone out of production back in 1970. There was no way this was a modern reproduction. When they developed the film inside, they were even more shocked. The photographs showed Kyiv exactly as it had looked in the 1950s. One image showed Sergei himself, posing in the same outfit he was wearing when arrested. Another showed a young woman, presumably his fiancée Valentina. And then there was the final photograph, the one that changed everything. A clear image of a bell-shaped object in the sky. Sergei genuinely believed everything he was saying, and more importantly, he had no explanation for how he'd arrived in 2006. After the evaluation, Sergei was sent back to his room at the clinic to rest, and then he vanished, completely disappeared. CCTV footage confirmed he'd entered his room, but he never came out. The door never opened again. The window had bars on it, making escape impossible. Yet somehow Sergei Ponomarenko was gone. Desperate for answers, investigators decided to dig into historical records from Soviet-era Ukraine. What they discovered sent chills down their spines. There had indeed been a Sergei Ponomarenko living in Kyiv during the 1950s, and he'd been declared missing. Not in 1958 as he'd claimed, but in 1960. But the investigation didn't stop there. The officers tracked down Valentina Kulish, Sergei's supposed fiancée. They knocked on her door, not knowing what to expect. An elderly woman, now in her 70s, answered. It was her. Valentina confirmed that her fiancé Sergei had indeed gone missing in 1958. But here's where it gets even stranger. She said he'd returned to her a few days later, claiming he'd seen into the future. He'd been terrified, confused, and kept talking about strange technology and buildings he couldn't explain. Then Valentina showed the investigators something that made their jaws drop. A photograph. In it, Sergei stood in what appeared to be Kyiv, but the skyline was completely different. Futuristic skyscrapers towered in the background. Technology that didn't exist in 2000. Valentina claimed the photo was dated 2050. How did she get this photograph? Had Sergei time-traveled more than twice? Where was he now? The mystery was never solved. Now, before you become a complete believer, I need to tell you something important. This story became so famous in Ukraine that it was featured on a television show called Aliens, where the events were recreated for dramatic effect. That CCTV footage I mentioned? It was part of the recreation. The photograph of the ID card? Also a recreation. And that image of Sergei in 2050? Analysis revealed that several of the skyscrapers were cloned using Photoshop. But here's the thing. These were always meant to be recreations for the TV show. The show never claimed the footage was original. So does that mean the story is fake? Not necessarily. The core account, the police reports, the testimonies, those elements were never definitively proven false. The recreation simply dramatized events that may or may not have actually occurred. What do you think? Could Sergei Ponomarenko really have slipped through time? Let's travel back to 1935. A British air marshal named Sir Robert Victor Goddard was on a routine flying mission. Goddard was an experienced, highly respected pilot traveling from Scotland back to his home base in Andover, England. As Goddard flew over the Scottish countryside, he passed over a derelict airbase near a place called Drem. This military station had been abandoned years earlier and converted into farmland. The hangars were crumbling, overgrown with weeds, and the runways were barely visible beneath the grass. But then, without warning, a storm rolled in out of absolutely nowhere. They were an otherworldly brown and yellow color, swirling with violent winds that seemed to come from every direction at once. Within seconds, Goddard lost complete control of his aircraft. The plane plummeted downward, spinning through the bizarre clouds as Goddard fought desperately to regain control. Finally, he emerged from the storm, sweating and panicked but miraculously still alive. He'd managed to wrestle back control of the plane, but when he looked down, his heart nearly stopped. The derelict airbase was gone. In its place was a fully functioning, bustling military installation. Workers in blue overalls, not the standard RAF brown, were moving between hangars, and the planes were unlike anything Goddard had ever seen. They were painted bright yellow, a color never used by the RAF. The design was completely unfamiliar. Goddard circled lower, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. He'd just flown over this exact spot minutes ago, and it had been abandoned. Before he could process what was happening, another violent storm cloud engulfed his plane. Once again, he was thrown into chaos, spinning and tumbling through the air. When he emerged this time, everything was back to normal. The airbase below was derelict again, exactly as it had been before. Goddard landed at his home base, shaken to his core. He immediately told everyone who would listen about his incredible experience. Most people thought he'd hallucinated, or suffered some kind of altitude-induced delusion. But Goddard was adamant. He knew what he'd seen. Years passed. Goddard's story became well known in military circles, often dismissed as the ramblings of a pilot who'd had a close call. But then, in 1939, something extraordinary happened. The British military decided to renovate the airbase near Drem. It was brought back into full operation, and here's where it gets spooky. The RAF changed their standard color scheme. Planes were now painted yellow, and the standard uniform, blue overalls. Everything Goddard had seen in 1935 had come true. The pilot himself became convinced he'd experienced what he called a time slip, a temporary blip in space-time that had allowed him to briefly see into the future. Skeptics argue he must have been hallucinating, or that he made the whole thing up for attention. But Goddard was a decorated air marshal with an impeccable reputation. Why would he risk his credibility on such a bizarre story? And how do you explain the fact that his vision came true in exact detail 4 years later? The yellow planes, the blue overalls, the fully operational base, everything matched. Coincidence? Goddard didn't think so. He went on to become a firm believer in the paranormal, and even wrote several books on unexplained phenomena. Until his death, he maintained that on that day in 1935, he'd genuinely glimpsed the future. Do you like this? Hit the like button, ring the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you'll never miss the next unbelievable case. If you're curious about the creepy photos taken in the forest, I've left a link at the top corner of the screen. I've also placed a direct link to it in the pinned comment below this video. And don't forget to come back for more unbelievable, time-defying cases. Many people have come forward claiming they were the first person to be recorded while traveling through time. In 2014, a man appeared in a YouTube interview using the pseudonym Dziga Vertov. He was wearing a strange mask or facial covering, and his voice was distorted. He was a time traveler from the 30th century, around the year 3000. In the interview, Vertov was cagey about specific details. When asked exactly when he was from, he replied, "I'm from the 30th, but that's all I'm going to tell you."
I'm from the 30th, but that's all I'm going to tell you.
I'm operating a little bit under the radar here, because there are plenty of people who don't approve of fraternizing with historic citizens. Vertov explained that he was hiding his identity to avoid detection by an organization called the Time Authority, a governing body from the future that apparently regulates time travel and prevents travelers from interfering with the past. According to Vertov, revealing too much information or bringing physical proof from the future could have catastrophic consequences for the timeline, but he did come with a warning. Your children and great-grandchildren will certainly see catastrophe. He claimed that in the relatively near future, society as we know it will collapse, money will cease to exist, governments will fall, humanity will face its darkest hour. But he assured viewers, we'll eventually rebuild. We'll learn from our mistakes and create a utopian society with access to limitless resources and technology beyond our current imagination. The interviewer pressed him for proof, for anything concrete that could verify his claims. Vertov became agitated. He insisted that bringing proof would violate the rules of the Time Authority and could alter the timeline in unpredictable ways. Skeptics rightfully point out that anyone could put on a mask and claim to be from the future. Without proof, it's just words. Was Vertov a genuine visitor from the year 3000, or just someone familiar with futurist predictions? We may never know. Let's talk about a case that involves government conspiracy, classified missions, and a photograph that supposedly shows a city from the year 8973. In 2018, a man named Alexander Smith appeared in several videos on a YouTube channel called Apex TV. He wore a strange mask or covering over his face, and his voice wavered with what seemed like nervousness or fear. His story was explosive. Alexander claimed he'd been recruited by the CIA back in 1981 for a top-secret time travel program. According to Smith, the government had successfully developed time travel technology decades ago and had been sending agents forward and backward through time on classified missions. He claimed he'd been sent to the year 8973 as part of an experimental program to document the far future. When he returned, the CIA had confiscated all of his evidence, all of his photographs, everything that could prove his journey had actually happened. But Smith had managed to keep one thing: a single photograph. He produced it during the interview, claiming it was a copy he'd secretly made before the CIA took the original. The image was blurry, incredibly grainy, and showed what appeared to be a futuristic cityscape with unusual architecture. Smith insisted this was a genuine photograph of a city nearly 7,000 years in our future. He went on to describe what he'd witnessed. According to Smith, humanity had survived and thrived. Technology had advanced beyond our wildest imagination. Climate change, which he urged modern humans to take seriously, had been addressed but not before, causing significant damage to the planet. He claimed the future he'd visited was both wondrous and served as a warning about the consequences of our current actions. The interviewer asked why he was coming forward now, decades after his supposed mission. Smith explained that he was dying and wanted the truth to be known before he passed away. He claimed the CIA had threatened him, monitored him, and done everything possible to keep him silent. But he felt a moral obligation to warn humanity about what he'd seen. The photograph is so blurry and low quality that it could be literally anything. It could be a painting, a video game screenshot, or just a deliberately obscured image of a modern city. Skeptics counter that this is exactly the kind of excuse a hoaxer would use. Make the evidence deliberately bad, then claim it's bad because of a cover-up. It's unfalsifiable, which makes it suspicious. If you thought the previous stories were strange, buckle up, because this next one is absolutely bonkers. In 2006, a Swedish man named Håkan Nordqvist had an experience that sounds like it came straight out of a science fiction movie. And it all started with a leaky sink. Håkan was at home one ordinary day when he noticed water dripping from underneath his kitchen sink. So he grabbed his tools and got down on his knees to fix the problem. He opened the cabinet door and reached inside to locate the source of the leak. But as his hand moved toward the back of the cabinet, something impossible happened. The back wall seemed to move away from him, receding into the distance as if the cabinet was somehow expanding. Confused, Håkan reached further and further. The space kept growing. Then, without warning, a blinding white light erupted from nowhere. It engulfed him completely, so bright he had to close his eyes. When the light finally faded and Håkan opened his eyes again, he wasn't in his kitchen anymore. He wasn't even in his house. He was standing outside, in broad daylight, in a place he didn't recognize. A person was standing in front of him, someone he recognized. It was himself, an older version of himself, probably in his 70s or 80s, standing there with a huge smile on his face. The older Håkan was delighted to see his younger self. He explained that young Håkan had somehow traveled forward in time and was now standing in the year 2042. They were in the same location, the same property, just decades in the future. The two versions of Håkan spent time talking, with the older version sharing details about what had happened in the intervening years. Håkan pulled out his cell phone and started recording video of the interaction. He filmed his older self, the futuristic surroundings, everything he could capture. The white light appeared again, and just as suddenly as he'd left, Håkan found himself back in his kitchen, on his knees in front of the sink cabinet. The leak was still there. Everything was exactly as it had been, except now he had video evidence of the impossible journey he'd just taken. Hakon's story was featured in a 2006 documentary where he showed the footage he'd captured. The video footage, while intriguing, isn't conclusive. Video can be faked, especially with the technology available even in 2006. The older man in the footage does look similar to Hakon, but that could be achieved with makeup, prosthetics, or simply finding someone who looks similar. Imagine falling asleep and waking up not years, but millennia later. That's exactly what allegedly happened to a man named Paul Amadeus Debunk, and his story is one of the most elaborate and detailed accounts of time travel ever recorded. Paul Amadeus Debunk was born in 1884 in Switzerland. He worked as a teacher and lived a relatively quiet life until tragedy struck. He was diagnosed with encephalitis lethargica, also known as the sleeping sickness. This devastating disease caused him to fall unconscious randomly for extended periods of time. His episodes became more frequent and more severe, and then, in 1921, Debunk fell into a coma that would change everything. When Debunk finally regained consciousness, he was in a hospital. But something was terribly wrong. This wasn't the Zurich hospital where he'd fallen into the coma. The building was completely different. The technology was unlike anything he'd ever seen. And most disturbing of all, he wasn't in his own body. Debunk found himself inhabiting the physical form of a man named Andreas Northam, a physicist who was recovering from an accident. Through Northam's memories, which Debunk could somehow access, he learned the impossible truth. He was in the year 3906, nearly 2,000 years in the future. Debunk couldn't understand the language the hospital staff spoke, but through Northam's memories, he could piece together what had happened to humanity in the intervening centuries. After our current era, Debunk learned humanity had faced catastrophic challenges. Violence, poverty, and overpopulation had pushed civilization to the brink of collapse. Resources became scarce. Nations fought over what little remained. And eventually, the inevitable happened. A devastating nuclear war broke out that nearly destroyed the human race. For an entire year, Debunk lived in this utopian future, experiencing a world of peace, prosperity, and spiritual advancement. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the experience ended. Debunk woke up back in his own body, in his own time, in the year 19. The future was gone. Being an educated man and an intellectual, Debunk knew better than to immediately tell people about his experience. He wrote everything down in meticulous detail, in a personal diary, documenting every aspect of the future world he'd experienced. In 1922, Debunk moved to Greece and began teaching there. He had a favorite student, a young man named George Papahatsis, who showed exceptional promise. Debunk trusted Papahatsis and eventually gave him the diary to read, with strict instructions never to share it with anyone else. After Debunk's death, Papahatsis decided the world needed to know about the diary's contents. In 1972, he published it, and Debunk's incredible story became public knowledge. The diary contained remarkably detailed descriptions of future technology, social structures, and historical events that would occur between our time and the year 3906. Some of Debunk's predictions have allegedly started coming true, which believers point to as evidence of the diary's authenticity. The mystery of Paul Amadeus Debunk remains unsolved. Was he a real person who genuinely experienced the year 3906? Our final story takes us to 1984, to a dusty old cottage in the quiet English village of Dawdleston. Ken Webster was a teacher living in the cottage with his girlfriend Debbie and their long-term house guest, Nicola. The three of them had recently begun renovating the old property, which dated back several centuries. One day, they noticed something odd. There were footprints on the floor and walls. But these weren't normal footprints. They had 6 toes. At first, they assumed it was some kind of prank. Maybe a friend had come by and created the prints as a joke. They cleaned them up and didn't think much more about it. But then, stranger things started happening. Much stranger. They would walk into a room and suddenly feel a dramatic drop in temperature, even though there was no draft or logical explanation. They saw strange shadows flickering across the walls when there was nothing to cast them. And on multiple occasions, they would enter the kitchen to find tins of cat food stacked in perfect pyramids on the counter. They didn't own a cat, but then Ken brought home a computer from the school where he taught, and everything changed forever. This was 1984, remember. Personal computers were still relatively new and primitive by today's standards. He set it up in the cottage, turned it on, And that's when things got truly weird. Text began appearing on the screen. Ken hadn't typed anything. Nobody was near the keyboard, but words were forming, line by line, as if someone invisible was typing them. What was happening? Soon a second message arrived, even odder, written in an old dialect and accusing Webster of stealing the house. It ended with the initials LW. At first Ken assumed it was a prank, but this was 1984, the internet was limited, and his machine was not connected to any network, so that explanation did not fit. On a hunch he typed a reply to LW, and sent it. To his shock a response came back, then another, and another. Bit by bit, LW and Ken began to build a conversation. LW said his name was Lucas, and he claimed to live in the 1500s, which explained the dialect, on the same plot where Ken's cottage now stood. He said he had caused the strange events through a kind of time slip, to get Ken's attention. Later Lucas added that he was also in contact with a third party, who said they were from the year 2000. Some academics have pushed back, noting inconsistencies in the language that suggest a hoax. Even so, we cannot be certain, and Ken insists that many messages arrived when no one was in the house to fake them. So what's the truth? Which of these 7 stories do you find most convincing? Are any of these stories genuine accounts of time travel? Or are they all hoaxes, misunderstandings, and wishful thinking? Drop a comment below and let me know which story resonated with you most and why. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of alleged time travelers, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. I've got more mind-bending mysteries coming your way, including stories about parallel dimensions, unexplained disappearances, and phenomena that science still can't explain. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out. Thanks for joining me on this journey through time. Whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between, I hope these stories made you question reality just a little bit, because in a universe as strange and vast as ours, who's to say what's truly impossible? Until next time, keep questioning, keep wondering, and keep your eyes open. You never know when you might encounter your own time traveler story.
Thanks for being with us. Leave a comment, like to show your support, and remember to hit that subscribe button for more exciting videos. See you next time.